Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Deku becomes a villain in Got Harem movie. So before we start, go check out the author of this fanfic, UnicornTalesLol. Link is in the description. Also subscribe to our channel and like this video. So let's begin the video. The young Izuku lay on the ground, his eyelids drooping. Everything hurts. Izuku let out a small groan, but didn't try to get up just yet. Even for a 4-year-old, he was smart. He knew he wouldn't be able to stand up, let alone move efficiently, in his current state. Kaken and his friends had left, leaving him on the ground with the kid he tried to protect. The other was still sobbing, although Izuku could make out the repeated apologies and broken thank yous. Izuku didn't bother looking towards the nearing footsteps, although a part of him instantly became more guarded. Was it the bullies again? Perhaps it was an adult. "Leave," a voice demanded. The sobbing kid above him looked up, eyes wide and fearful, as he stared at the figure before him. The figure glowered down at him, his eyes flashing dangerously. The smaller one flinched, more tears springing from his eyes. With one more apology, the boy scrambled up and ran away, sobbing all the way. Izuku looked up as the boy ran away, and he smiled slightly. At least he would be alright now. The figure from before walked up to him, taking in the boy's pitiful state. With a huff, he dropped down next to Izuku, staring strangely at the other. "Why did you do that?" he asked. Izuku turned to stare at him, noting how the boy was older than him and his shaggy gray bluish hair. "You shouldn't have protected him. I bet you regret it now." Izuku smiled and shook his head. "No, I don't regret it," he murmured lightly. "I'm actually quite glad, to be honest." His smile widened, turning into a bright grin. The other blinked, staring at him in shock. "I think you may have hit your head a little too hard," he deadpanned. "What's your name?" Izuku asked curiously, ignoring his comment. The other stared down at him, his eyes calculating and guarded. With a relenting sigh, he figured he had nothing else to lose at this point. "Shigaraki Tomura," he stated. Izuku smiled. "Midoriya Izuku," he shouted, beginning to pull himself up. "You shouldn't move yet," Tomura frowned. Izuku merely smiled again and continued to pull himself up until he was fully sitting up. Tomura let out a sigh, realizing the boy wouldn't listen to him. "Why did you do that?" "That up?" he questioned, tilting his head to the side. "Because I wanted to." "No, not that. I mean earlier. Why did you stand up for that boy? Did you really think the other kids wouldn't attack you?" "I knew they would attack me. If anything, I was counting on it." "Why? If you knew they would attack you instead, why did you bother stepping in?" "That's exactly it. I knew they would attack me instead and they wouldn't hurt the other kid. I didn't want him to be hurt. I'd rather take it on myself." "Why?" Tomura repeated. "Why would you rather take it on yourself?" "Well, it's better this way," he stuttered, looking down, his confident aura now lost. Tomura narrowed his eyes on the boy. "And why would that be?" he challenged. He didn't understand this boy. He was around the age of 4 or perhaps 5, and yet he was already getting beaten up. "For what?" "Well, you see, I'm actually quirkless." Izuku stammered his explanation, nervously tripping over his words. There was a pang in his heart as he admitted the truth, but he desperately tried to push it away. He was still scared. Scared that he was powerless in such a world, scared that he'd be pushed around by society, scared that no one would even look in his direction anymore, scared that no one would ever see him as anything in general. He didn't want to admit it, but his dreams had become even further away. They had shifted to a place that he could not reach and probably never would reach. But he wouldn't give up just yet. He may be quirkless, but he'd still be a hero one way or the other. Tomura blinked, staring at Izuku in shock. "Quirkless? Quirkless? If you're quirkless, then why on earth would you even think of doing something like that?" Tomura demanded, his eyes blazing. This wasn't right. He didn't know how or why, but his gut twisted and his mind screamed at him, how why wasn't that right? Something inside of him burned. Tomura felt both confusion and rage fill him as a different emotion filled him. He didn't understand it and it was going to drive him nuts unless he figured it out. "Because that's all I can do now," Izuku muttered sadly, yet he smiled despite the tears filling his eyes. "I'm quirkless, a useless Deku just like they said. I can't do anything because of that and I can never be a hero. So, if this is the only way I can help someone, why wouldn't I? I want to be useful in my own way, I guess. A hero in my own way," Izuku explained. Tomura's jaw dropped. His confusion was pushed away by the rage overcoming him, overwhelming him and taking over his being. What? That wasn't right. How could that be right? How could that ever be right? Being quirkless meant being useless. How did that even work? "It doesn't, it just doesn't," Tomura concluded. There was something severely wrong here. What was it? Tomura scratched at his throat, a nervous habit he had picked up somewhere. Frustration filled him. What the actual hell? How did being quirkless become useless? How did anyone even get to that conclusion? Izuku stared at the other in alarm, reaching his own bruised hands out to stop Tomura. Hey. Stop that. You're hurting yourself. Izuku cried, trying to pry Tomura's hands away from his neck. Tomura continued to scratch at his neck, practically clawing and ripping the skin away. What was this feeling growing inside of him? He could easily recognize the anger, the absolute rage, but what was the other thing? He didn't understand. Shigaraki-san. Izuku shouted, finally managing to pry one of his hands away from his neck. He held the hand in place, having to use up practically the last of his energy to do so. Tomura snapped out of gaze, his eyes flickering over to Izuku. He stared at him. I don't understand you, he stated. Or perhaps it was something else that he did not understand. Tomura silently agreed to himself. There was something else he didn't understand, didn't like, and rather hated. What was it? What made you say that? He asked. Huh? Say what? Izuku's grip loosened on his wrist, but he still held it firmly in place, in case he tried to itch his neck off again. Tomura lowered his free hand from his neck slightly, still staring intently at Izuku. Why do you think you're worthless because you're quirkless? He asked. Well, that's what everyone says. I can't be a hero since I don't have a quirk and no one likes me anymore. Kaken hates me now, and so does everyone in my class. All my friends hate me too. I wanted to be a hero one just like All Might. But I can't be now, since I'm quirkless. I'm as useless as I am now, just like everyone says. Mom says otherwise, but I can see it in her eyes. She's always pitying me too, Izuku muttered. I really am just a Deku. Tomura's body shook with rage. He grit his teeth, his nails already back to digging into his neck. What the actual heck? Worthless because you're quirkless. Having your dreams crushed because you're quirkless. Rejected and practically exiled because he was quirkless. Was that really how this world was run? Before Izuku could even blink, Tomura snatched his wrist back, quickly twisting his own hand to grab Izuku's wrist this time, and stood up, grabbing Izuku by the collar with his other hand, and yanking him up too. You're not useless. It's not you. It's someone else. I swear it's not you that's useless. Tomura shouted before trailing off. Who was it? He knew for a fact it wasn't Izuku, so who was it? The school. The people that didn't believe in him. Everybody. Yes, that's exactly right, Tomura, a voice stated. It's not him who's at fault. It's the current society, the voice continued. Tomura froze, his grip on Izuku loosening. He looked towards Kurogiri, eyes widening before narrowing dangerously. Kurogiri held the phone up, expression unclear due to his body being missed. What? Tomura demanded, yet he kept his voice as calm as possible, careful not to disrespect Sensei. I believe we can talk about this elsewhere, the man stated. Tomura released Izuku, and the boy wavered on his legs before he regained his balance. Tomura stared at him from the corner of his eye, prepared to catch the boy in case he fell. Kurogiri lowered the phone slightly as he stepped forward. For now, perhaps it would be best for you to take your leave. Tomura frowned, but did not say anything. He couldn't come up with a valid argument anyways. He let out a huff and walked towards Kurogiri. Whatever, he mumbled dejected as he stuffed his hands into his pockets and walked towards the portal warper. See you around, Midoriya-san, he spoke, sending a quick glance over his shoulder to look at the boy. Izuku nodded meekly, slightly confused at the situation. Aye, he muttered, giving a small wave. Tomura fully turned around and walked down the path with Kurogiri. As he turned the corner, he glanced at Izuku once more, their eyes locked, and he immediately knew that this would not be the last time they met. They would meet many more times, after all. Izuku grinned, his eyes shut in his common ray of sunshine grin. Tomura felt himself grin as well, considering how contagious Izuku's happiness often was. Kurogiri picked up another glass and instantly began cleaning it. Izuku turned to him, briefly wondering if Kurogiri had just started to re-clean glasses, considering how little glasses he ever actually used. Maybe it was a bartender thing. You're supposed to be smart, Isaacin. Where'd all your smartness go? Tomura asked with a chuckle. Izuku gasped and spun back around to face Tomura, eyes wide with disbelief. Tomura nai. That's mean. Izuku accused, pouting slightly. The truth is always very painful, Isaacin, Tomura chuckled. Izuku huffed, glaring at him before turning to face the clock on the wall, eyes widening in alarm. Ah. I'm going to be late for school. He cried, quickly gulping down the rest of his juice before scrambling off his seat to pick up his bag. Tomura blinked before turning to the clock himself, silently confirming that Izuku was indeed going to be late for school, unless he bolted now. You should keep a better check of time, Tomura lectured plainly, hiding his amused grin as he drank from his own glass. Izuku glared at him before attempting a small smile, sighing slightly. I suppose that's what I get for visiting so early in the morning, Izuku muttered, roughly chucking his backpack onto his shoulder. You should visit more often, Kurogiri stated. You're always welcome here. Thanks, Kurogiri-kun. I appreciate it. Izuku grinned, his eyes sparkling. Tell me if that bastard Kaken does anything to you today so I can kill him. Tomura growled. Izuku snapped his head in his direction, glaring lightly, but his eyes held warmth, appreciating just how well loved he was by the one he considered an older brother. But still, murder was unacceptable. He opened his mouth to say something back, but Kurogiri cut him off. Do you want me to take you to school? I could wrap you there without any trouble, and it'd save you plenty of time, Kurogiri offered, not wanting the two boys to argue when Izuku was clearly running low on time. No, it's fine. You really shouldn't do that though, Kurogiri, you could get arrested. You know, quirks are banned unless it's self-defense, Izuku said. Tomura snorted, but didn't turn around or say anything. Izuku sent a quick glance to him before turning back to Kurogiri. Thanks for the offer though. And thanks for the drinks. Bye. Izuku opened the door, immediately running out with a small wave. Tomura watched him leave through the corner of his eye, his smile long gone. As soon as the door shut, Tomura returned his gaze to his drink. Several minutes passed in silence, the only noise was the clinking of glasses as Kurogiri cleaned Izuku's glass. He's far too innocent, Tomura stated dryly after a while. Kurogiri nodded, silently agreeing with his words. Do you think he'll survive with the way he keeps going? Tomura didn't look up from his drink, seemingly lost in his own thoughts. Kurogiri stared at him, expression unreadable. With a sigh, he placed the glass on the counter. Perhaps. He's gotten this far after all, hasn't he? That has to count for something, Kurogiri stated. Tomura frowned. Silence engulfed the room once more as Tomura lost himself in his thoughts. His dream is annoying, Tomura growled out after a while. Kurogiri waited for him to elaborate, knowing the team needed to get whatever was on his mind off his chest. I don't understand why he's so intent on becoming a hero. I know there's more to it, but one of the reasons he wants to become a hero is to prove everyone wrong, after all. You of all people know how much he's hated for being quirkless and for having a dream. Even if he let that dream go, I heavily doubt the bullying would stop. They all believe he can't do anything, so a major part of him wants to prove them wrong and that he can do something, Kurogiri explained. He knew this was a sensitive topic for Tomura, seeing as when he first found out about Izuku's dream he had had a major fit and destroyed everything he could get his hands on, followed by several weeks of sulking and tantrums at the slightest upset. When Izuku finally managed to get to him bringing up wanting to be like All Might had only worsened things for the worst. His hate for the symbol of peace had only intensified beyond belief during that time. Mentioning All Might around the explosive teen was deadly to new extremes. If it had been anyone other than Izuku, one of the only people he ever only opened up to and thought of as a little brother, Midoriya Izuku would have been dead several times over. Whilst Tomura still valued Izuku dearly, he had hated the one he thought of as a brother forever wanting to be like All Might. He was extremely unsupportive of Izuku's dream, but Izuku being Izuku, persisted that he didn't need anyone to believe in him and kept pursuing his dream regardless. Tomura, secretly although it wasn't as secretive as he thought it was, just wanted Izuku to finally have his dreams crushed and become a villain, however harsh that sounds. He wanted Izuku to see just how unjust the justice system actually was and fight alongside him to achieve his goal. Although Izuku may not have a quirk, he had so much potential even Sensei himself believed that and hoped for Izuku to follow Tomura one day and was capable of so much more than he let on. His analyzing skills were amazing, and even both Tomura and Kurogiri had learned a lot about analyzing quirks to find their strengths and weaknesses. In some cases, Izuku had even shown Tomura how to find a way to cancel out certain quirks. While Tomura was occasionally tempted to just force Izuku into the villain world, he knew that he could not do that, one of the main reasons being that he didn't want to hurt his little brother. On top of that, Sensei had taught Tomura that someone like Izuku would surely be hard to break to force him into something he didn't want to do. Even Sensei himself wanted Izuku to be a villain and had met the boy on several occasions, even being the boy to be a great influence to Tomura and stimulating his growth to levels not even he could have helped Tomura reach so quickly. With a heavy heart, Tomura dreaded the day Izuku might actually become a hero, as he would know it was only a certain amount of time before the two clashed and may become enemies. He wanted to spend as much time with Izuku before that day though, as he did not want to lose him. He could only pray that Izuku would finally see the darkness behind society before he actually became a hero. Tomura sighed, losing himself in his drink before getting up to return to bed. Kurogiri didn't question him, knowing that he had only gotten out of bed to begin with because Izuku had come to visit. Izuku weaved through the crowds of people, hurrying his way to school. If he kept up his current pace, he'd make it to school in no time. Despite the fact he was headed to school, a place where his life was frequently made hell due to bullying, he couldn't help but grin. While his body ran towards his school, basically on autopilot, his mind had drifted off elsewhere. Back to Tomura, specifically. He had basically grown up with him, to the point that he had a room in the apartment Kurogiri owned. He had stayed over countless times over the years. His mind drifted back to when he first met Tomura. When he first met him, he was unsure of what to think, as his mind was unable to comprehend some of the things Tomura was getting at. Now, though, he understood more of what Tomura was getting at. Kind of. They had met again a couple days after, and even now, Izuku had the ever-growing suspicion that Tomura had been looking for him. Although, he had no way of proving that. Their meetings had become a regular thing after their second meeting at the park where Izuku often played. They had gotten to know each other more. At the time, Tomura had been a relatively calm person, albeit very mysterious and somewhat detached, but eventually, that personality seemed to shatter, replaced with one that of insanity. Although he kept it on the down low, as often as possible, Izuku, being as observant as always, had obviously noticed. They seemed like normal outbursts, but to those who looked close enough, which Izuku often did, and regretted it, you could clearly see it, the hatred, the anger, the bloodlust. Like a monster seeking destruction. There were times even when Izuku found himself steering clear of Tomura, in fear of his outbursts. They had started off mild, not occurring very often, but eventually it had become full-blown out tantrums. Mysterious destruction of property objects were just disintegrated, crumbled, turned to dust somehow, and more often than not, somebody would be hurt, whether it was minor and major. Izuku remembers, once, he had tried to stop one of Tomura's outbursts. He remembered Tomura reaching out for the person who made him mad, a grin full of insanity etched onto his face. He didn't quite remember what fully happened after that though. But he does remember jumping in front of Tomura, trying to stop him from hurting the other kid, and a searing pain somewhere in his body, before he could smell the scent of blood. After that, he had, from what he was told, anyways, fainted. He woke up in the hospital a week later, delirious and confused as to what was happening to him. Tomura's outbursts had been severely contained since, and Izuku noted how Tomura was always trying his best to hide his outbursts from him more and stay calm whenever he was in his presence. He didn't want Izuku to see him like that ever again. He didn't want to do that ever again. But that scar would never fade. Izuku huffed as he reached his school gates, finally having reached his destination. A full-blown smile was on his face as walked in, glad that he had been able to reach school in time. There was muttering and murmurs surrounding him, people whispering and chatting about him, but Izuku paid it no mind. He didn't care. They could say whatever they wanted, but they would never bring him down. Because he was unbreakable. He had a strong will. That's what Kurogiri says too, and that's all he ever needed. He is strong, and he would show them. One day he would become a hero and prove them all wrong. But that thought in mind, Izuku bravely marched into school. The day itself had gone relatively normal. Classes were the same boring lectures, occasional wad of paper thrown at his head, a few sneers here and there, etc. The normal. Well, except for one thing. He hadn't seen Kaken today. That never ended well. In normal cases, if he hadn't seen Katsuki for the entire day, then that usually meant he was planning something. Something Izuku would prefer to avoid out of concern for his own health and Kaken's record. In normal cases, non-Izuku cases anyways, people wouldn't care about their bully's record. After all, why should they? They're bullies, and they make your life so much harder. But unfortunately, Izuku was one of rare idiotic but adorable cases where he did care for his bully's record, because despite everything, Izuku still looked up to Kaken. He always did and always would. Kaken had one of the best quirks ever, and his personality suited it too. He was just as explosive as his quirk, and he was strong. He was going to be a great hero one day. But maybe that was why Izuku also despised him sometimes. Kaken was strong without a doubt, and he could do almost anything. He was an aspiring hero for sure. But why was it that someone like him could become a hero? He was a bully, he basically abused his power, and he never really cared for other people. It wasn't fair. Izuku himself truly wanted to be a hero because he wanted to help people, to save people from their despair, like the symbol of HOPE1, and just generally be a good person. He wasn't in it for the money. He just wanted to be useful to help. But Kaken hungered for power. He wasn't even that nice to his friends' followers, more likely, actually, and he wanted to be stronger than All Might. Kaken was strong, but Izuku doubted he would be that strong. But that was all. He didn't want to be a hero to help people or to make a difference. He just wanted power. Tomura had told him many times before that quite a lot of pro-heroes were only heroes to begin with because they were in it for the money or for some other selfish gain of theirs, and almost all heroes were people like Katsuki. Izuku shivered at the thought. As much as he looked up to Kaken, if he had to work with people like him every single day of his life in masses, Izuku wasn't so sure that he did want to be a hero. It was that doubt that occasionally put him off wanting to become a hero. Surely not all heroes were as bad as Tomura made them out to be, right? Right? After all, there were heroes like Endeavor and Eraserhead. They didn't want power or to beat the #1 hero All Might, right? He vaguely remembers Tomura snickering, while Kurogiri merely turns away and doesn't say anything, making his doubt grow somewhat. He was certain that there were some good heroes out there. After all Might was a hero. So hope was not lost. The strong survive and the weak die, Izuku muttered to himself as he walked throughout campus. He had been late to leave the class due to wanting to finish his notes, making him the last one to leave his class. His mind was still occupied on the topic of heroes and what Tomura had told him about them. Only the strong heroes will make it after all, that's how people got into UA. By being strong. But with villains, there were 3 types, strong, weak, and then pathetically weak. It's a genuine surprise they weren't dead in the gutter by now as stated by Tomura. What the fuck are you mumbling about now, you damn nerd? An agitated voice asked. Izuku's head shot up in surprise before he whirled around to face the source of the voice, Katsuki Bakugo. Straight away, he can tell Kaken is lacking his usual lackeys, and after a quick surveillance around the area there's nobody else around either. That isn't good. What are you doing here? Izuku stutters as he frantically waves his arms around in a panic. Confrontations alone or at all are never good, especially if it's with Kaken. What do you fucking think, dork? I go to school here, Kaken snorts. Right, sorry, Kaken. He looks down at the ground, unsure of what to do. He couldn't exactly just turn around and walk away. Kaken would throw a fit at being ignored, and Izuku didn't exactly have anything to say either. What were you mumbling about? At this, Kaken's eyes narrow, his eyes calculating. Oh, it was nothing, really. I was just thinking, Izuku waves his hands in front of him, as if that could magically stop the conversation from going any further. Don't give me that bullshit. The weak die, and the strong survive. Why the fuck are you thinking of that? Kaken asked. Izuku stops waving his hands for a moment as he stares at Kaken, his guard flying up. Why does it matter? He asks, traces of his normally meek and socially awkward personality disappearing into thin air. Kaken glares and Izuku can already see the smoke rising from his hands. Huss, I said so, nerd. Now answer the damn question. Just because you say it doesn't mean it matters. You're irrelevant, Izuku states, his eyes hardening. Rip Deku 2001 to 2017, Kaken's eye twitches and his hands let off small explosions as he takes a couple of threatening steps towards Izuku as he glowers at him. What? Kaken growls, menacingly towering over Izuku, eyes full of murderous intent. I said you're. This time Izuku manages to catch himself before he goes too far and suddenly, he's shivering with fear as he realizes what he's done. His brave personality fades away, his normal personality back in full force. You're fucking out with it, Deku. Kaken screams, lifting his hands up and setting off some more explosions. Oh god, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it, I swear. He mumbles, hands once again frantically waving in front of his face. Kaken stands up straight, looking down at Deku, face almost void of emotion. Deku, who the fuck do you think you are? Midori Izuku, he blurts out before he can even stop himself. Kaken lands in his shoulder, practically blowing up his confidence already. Perhaps we need to have a talk to see who's in charge here, Kaken demands, and before Izuku can even attempt to stutter out a sentence or do anything, Katsuki is already pushing him elsewhere. Izuku winced as he slammed into the wall. His back tingles with pain, but he forces his eyes open, looking up at Kaken with wide, fearful eyes. Deku, Kaken growled, still holding him by the collar of his uniform. Yes. Izuku muttered, refusing to look him in the eyes, already fearing their burning gaze. It was honestly a surprise as to how his eyes couldn't explode, considering how intense his gaze was and his quirk. Which also led to the question whether Kaken's hair could be set on fire or not. What the fuck was that? He asked. Deku stared at a pebble a little while away, finding its unusual structure absolutely amazing. Note the sarcasm. I don't know what you're talking about, Kaken. Kaken's grip on his shirt tightened, lifting him into the air slightly. Squirming slightly, Deku managed to feel the ground again as he remained on his tiptoes. Better than nothing. Where did pebbles even come from? There were no cracks in the structure of the building or floor, so that really was an interesting question. Surely they'd come from. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Deku. Look me in the eye when I'm talking to you, shit nerd. Deku's eyes remained fixated on the pebble, mind desperately analyzing the pebble in order to give himself a distraction, a mental escape. Look at me, Kaken demanded. If you're going to beat me up, just do it, Izuku stated absent-mindedly. How did rocks even structure themselves? did the molecules. What the fuck is with you? Kakin started, pulling Deku towards him before slamming him back into the wall once more. Pain sprinkled across his back, but he refused to acknowledge it. You're always disappearing, sometimes you're way too fucking confident, you have that word a scar from fuck knows where, and wait a minute, Kakin's eyes narrowed as he suddenly remembered. Inwardly, Deku screamed in both frustration and fear. Why couldn't he have just forgotten it? How many times had he been beaten up because of that scar, because he refused to tell anyone? Not that it was any of their business anyways, but damn. People were always chasing him, questioning him, and demanding an answer. People had tried everything, even asking teachers, which resulted in phone calls to his mom, demanding answers, but his mother never had any proper response to give. He had been accused of basically everything. Secretly being a villain, getting caught up in a villain attack, hero training, bullying. Honestly, he was quite surprised that one hadn't worked. He was always bullied, after all getting too close to something dangerous, self-inflicted, crossfire, home abuse, surgery. He didn't quite understand that one, but rumors had been flying around and so many other crazy accusations. Sometimes the accusations were so nuts, Izuku was generally concerned for whoever created it. One of those being that he was abducted by aliens. While, technically, it would not be impossible, considering how superpowers were once considered impossible, and then suddenly, they just basically popped out of thin air, it was not too far-fetched. However, there was something about people asking about that scar that actually made Izuku angry. They asked how he got a scar like that, yet they didn't care that they were always hurting him. He was bullied, that was almost as clear as day unless he was hiding it, say, from his mother, etc. And he was physically hurt by people, beaten up on a daily basis, but yet they were suddenly scared when he had a scar like that. Where the heck was the logic in that? Not only that, but they tried to beat the answer out of him. What in their messed up minds made that even somewhat logical? Mine. Of course, there was always the one person who couldn't be fooled, no matter what excuse Deku tumbled out with. Kakin. They were childhood friends and had remained best friends until they were 10. After Kakin had found out about him being quirkless, he hadn't abandoned him. No, if anything, Kakin held him closer than ever. Although, there was still that one incident where he beat him up, but it was after that Kakin realized and changed his mind. He was always protecting him from other people after that, always shielding him from people's glares and sneers, making sure he never heard the hurtful reminders and words, scaring away the bullies and sometimes, occasionally possible friends. Kakin had been so overprotective of him as kids that it got to the point where Deku wasn't even allowed friends other than him. One too many people had tried to use him for his brain, so Kakin had just decided to not let him have any other friends. He didn't need them after all. He had him, and that was all he needed. Naturally, he hadn't told him about Tomura, although there were a few slip-ups here and there. Even though Tomura and Kakin hadn't met, there was a deep hatred between the two. After all, it was Tomura who had created the rift between the two, ending their friendship. It was because of that incident that Izuku lost one of his childhood friends. The only difference between Kakin and Tomura was that Tomura actually knew where to find Kakin and not the other way around. Which often resulted in Izuku finding Tomura hiding out in the bushes, waiting to jump Kakin, something that Izuku had luckily been able to stop or avoid. Yes, he was glad that Tomura was willing to go so far as his friend, but he'd fear that one of them would generally end up dead. Izuku wasn't completely blind, he had seen the signs of a villain within Tomura, though he chose to ignore it. He had hoped that Tomura wouldn't actually walk the path of a villain, and he was just overthinking it. That was normally the case. Why won't you tell me where you got that fucking scar? Kakin demanded. Deku's eyes steeled, something Kakin noted in his mind, and his stare practically turned into a glare as he refused to turn away from the rock. Deku stayed quiet, refusing to answer. No one would ever know. It was the secret between Midoriya Izuku and Shigaraki Tomura, and it would stay that way. Deku tried not to shiver at the feeling of being found out when he thought of it like that. You're always fucking disappearing. You're always fucking lying and avoiding the truth. You always tell the damn truth when it comes to other things, and you hate fucking lying, so why won't you tell me the damn truth? Because you're not supposed to know, Izuku whispered. He could feel his body tremble slightly, and a lump formed in his throat. No one is. He desperately stared at the rock, trying to come up with more analysis to take over his brain and distract him from his childhood friend. One he could no longer consider a friend. Tomura had said so. What is so important that I can't fucking know? Kakin growled. The truth, Izuku thought. What are you hiding? You want to be a hero, don't you? Even though you're fucking quirkless and you're no one's hero and never will be, you want to be a damn hero. Heroes aren't supposed to lie, fuckmensch. Kakin screamed. Tears burned in Deku's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Look at me in the eyes when I'm talking to you. So, the pebble comes from a bigger structure like a rock which originates from Deku. Eyes still burning with tears, Deku slowly looked up to his old friend's heated eyes. Under the intense stare, Deku couldn't handle a single second before he looked past Kaken, staring at the bushes in the distance. The fuck is wrong with you? Just do what you want, I don't care. Deku wants to be anywhere but here. Hell, if the choices were to be beaten up by his classmates or to be stuck in the middle of nowhere, he'd take it. Just as long as it was anywhere but here, with Kaken, and a topic he had worked so hard to avoid. Anywhere, practically anything, just away from this conversation. What? Just beat me up already or something, I don't care. Just stop talking. The tears finally fell, and even though he wasn't looking directly at Kaken, his gaze was far too intense, and so he shifted it back to the pebble. He needed to make up his own distant world or something that he could escape to in his mind for situations like this. Or perhaps it was just best to be quiet. No, that'd either kill him on the inside or make the situation worse. Kaken stared at him, unnervingly quiet. Deku couldn't make out his face, and quite frankly he wasn't sure he even wanted to. Deku squeezed his eyes shut, not wanting to be in that moment anymore. He waited for the pain or even the words to come, but nothing came. He could hear birds tweeting, cicadas making the usual racket, and even Kaken surprisingly even breathing. The lack of pain or words actually bothered him to the point where he opened his eyes, just to double check he was still in the situation he thought he was. Upon seeing the pebble, he inwardly shrugged before actually turning to Kaken. Before he could even see Kaken's face, he was thrown to the side, his side and head crashing into the wall. He winced, and he was fairly sure there was a dull click within his head upon impact, and he slid down the wall to land on the floor. His ears buzzed, and he barely suppressed a groan, confused and somewhat delirious. He opened his eyes, blinking, and looked up to Kaken, expecting to see a fist, kick, or even explosion come his way. However, Kaken's back was to him as he walked away, walking back to the opening of the alley. What? Deku asked absent-mindedly, his mind trying to draw up some kind of conclusion as to what the heck just happened, ignoring the warm feeling slipping down his head. Kaken was just walking away like that. Walking away without saying or doing anything. What? He's never done that. Was he giving up? That didn't make sense, he was Kaken. Kaken never gave up until he was satisfied. Deku stared at Kaken's back, his mind coming up with different conclusions and theories. Don't think I'm giving up, nerd, Kaken stated, stopping at the end of the alley. Deku blinked, switching his full attention to Kaken, who hadn't even turned to face him. I'm still going to figure out what the fuck you're hiding, just you fucking watch. Without another word, Kaken walked from the alley, stuffing his hands into his pocket and stomping off elsewhere. Deku blinked, processing his words slowly. So that was it. Mind still disoriented, Deku stood up, wiping the blood from his head. I doubt you actually tripped over and hit your head, Izuku. Do you really expect me to believe that? Kurogiri asked, wiping away the blood from Izuku's head with a warm rag. Izuku laughed lightly, rubbing the back of his head. I guess I should have expected that you wouldn't believe me, Izuku said lightheartedly. Kurogiri sighed, placing the moderately blood-covered rag on the counter. Luckily, it's only a mild concussion, so it's not too serious, but I still don't think you should go to school, Kurogiri stated. No, I have to go to school, Kurogiri. I can't just skip it whenever I feel like it. Whenever you feel like Izuku, you have a concussion, you shouldn't, Kurogiri stutters out. A mild concussion, Izuku interrupted. He was fairly sure that Kurogiri was glaring at him, but he chose to ignore it. It's still a concussion, which is dangerous by itself, Kurogiri warned. Izuku shrugged. It's fine. It's not, Tomura growled out, clenching his fists. It was that bastard again, wasn't it? Izuku turned to stare at him, eyes calculating. It wasn't him, Izuku stated dryly. Tomura's eyes narrowed as he glared at him. They were currently in Kurogiri's bar, which happened to be just next to the apartment complex that Kurogiri also owned. Tomura was sitting on one of the couches near the wall, one leg pulled up onto the sofa, while the other was merely resting on the floor. Why are you always trying to protect him? Tomura demanded. Honestly, that was an answer Izuku himself didn't fully know. He should hate Kaken for always picking on him, but he doesn't really bear Kaken any hatred. Kaken was cool. He was powerful, and he was one of the main figures in his life that he looked up to. Of course, there was a small part of him that resented him, because Kaken had so much potential to become powerful, even with his personality, but that part had been pushed away to the darkest parts of his mind. Kaken had been his friend for so long, and had protected him for so long. Kaken deserved to be a hero, even if he did bully people or think of them as unimportant extras. Doesn't matter, Izuku turned to the counter, picking up the drink Kurogiri had given him. Silence passed through the bar, except for the sound of Kurogiri placing the first aid kit away. After a couple of minutes, Tomura spoke up once more. You're staying here today and tomorrow, Tomura stated. Izuku turned to face him. What? And you're not going to school tomorrow either, Tomura finished. Izuku blinked before his damaged mind finally understood that Tomura was demanding it, not actually giving him a choice in the matter. Kurogiri calls up his mother and tells her he'll be here for the rest of the week. Wah hey. Izuku whipped around to face Kurogiri, only to see the mist-like man was already disappearing through the door in search of his phone. You can't just decide that without my permission. Izuku cried, turning back around to face Tomura, who had crossed his arms as well. He still looked pissed, but Izuku could see the amusement in his eyes. Just did. But you can't. Dude, I just did. You know where your room is. Kurogiri, I'll call the school and tell them your reason, it's fine, Tomura waved him off. Wah, but it's Izuku stammered. Tomura raised an eyebrow, waiting for his reaction. That's not. Spit it out, Izuku. You can't just do that. I can't skip school for something like this. It's not against the law, so stop worrying. Besides, you do have a reason, Tomura scoffed. But my attendance and school work. PFT, you're smart. You'll catch up. Screw attendance. That's not the point, Tomura. You already make me miss school sometimes, I can't keep doing this. Izuku wailed. Wasn't that part of the reason why Kaken confronted him sometimes? Because he's never there? Although, technically, that doesn't make sense either. Too bad. You're injured and I'm not letting you go to school. Tomura stood up, stretching slightly, before leaving the room. Tomura nai. Izuku shouted. I'll be in my room. Tomura waved him off, placing his hands behind his head as he walked off to his room. Kurogiri entered the room shortly after, slipping his phone into his pocket. Your mother knows you're staying here and she's fine with it, Kurogiri explained, picking up a glass and a rag from somewhere before cleaning said glass. Izuku let out a loud groan before face-planting the counter in exasperation and literally knocking himself out. His world went dark. The first thing Izuku takes note of is the throbbing of pain in his head. While it was dull at first, the more he became conscious, the more it hurt. Try as he might, he couldn't suppress his groan of pain. He opened his eyes, blinking away the blurriness and the need to throw up rose in his throat. He gagged, sitting up and taking a deep breath. He felt horrible. It was then that he noticed he was lying on a bed. Still delirious, he took a look around the room he was in and relaxed slightly, noting that he was in his room in Kurogiri's apartment complex. He fell back onto the bed, breathing deeply through his nose as he collected his thoughts. Did he get beat up again? That would explain the pain in his head. But if that was the case, then he'd be hurting all over and not just in his head. Unless they decided to kick his head repeatedly, in which case they were idiots because they could have killed him. Yet, that really didn't feel right. Digging through his memories, Izuku eventually remembered what had happened and he groaned once more. Like Kaken wasn't already annoyed, as it was, now he would be skipping school. Either Kaken would take that as him running away or avoiding any confrontations. Well, Izuku would be glad to skip any future confrontations, that would only make matters worse. Oh god, he was going to die, wasn't he? He needed something to drink, he vaguely realized. His throat was dry and actually kind of itchy. Ugh, he hated that feeling. Sighing, he pulled himself up from the bed. The room was dark, but he could just about make out everything. There was a glass of water on the bedside table, along with a pill. A painkiller, most likely. Mentally nothing to thank Kurogiri later, Izuku put the pill into his mouth and swallowed a gulp of water along with it. The rest of the water followed suit. Izuku placed the glass down with a content sigh, already feeling better. It was dark, meaning he must have slept for most of the day already. He still had homework to do, he thought numbly, reaching out for the door. He frowned, pulling it, but the door made no sign of budging. Pushing it, the door still didn't open. That wasn't right. He pulled the door again, this time using more force. Tomura. He growled, trying to yank the door open, only succeeding in rattling the door. He let out a yell, hitting the door with his fist. Damn it, he shouted. Of course Tomura would lock him in his room. It wasn't the first time he'd done so, and Izuku doubted it'd be the last, but man, he needed to stop. I do not appreciate this. He shouted, though he doubted anyone would actually hear him. Kurogiri would be in the bar, and Tomura would most likely be there too. He groaned. Great, now what was he supposed to do? You're not supposed to. A voice shouted back, slightly startling Izuku. Perhaps he wouldn't be locked in here for long after all. Tomura, let me out. His head pounded in response, the painkillers clearly not having taken any effect just yet. Go back to bed. Tomura demanded, not sounding all too bothered. Izuku could faintly hear the sound of gunshots, signaling that Tomura was most likely playing video games. At least, he hoped that was the case, and it wasn't a nearby villain attack. That would be rather disastrous. I'm not tired, he replied. Normal people would probably be cussing their lives out at this point, but Izuku was all too familiar with the situation to even bother cursing his life. He didn't hate Tomura for this, after all, it was his way of protecting him. An annoying way, sure, but still protective. Izuku was fairly sure Tomura had heard the saying kept under lock and key and took it quite literally. Too bad. Go back to bed anyways. Tomura nai. Izuku whined. This isn't fair. Silence followed, except for the occasional sound of muffled gunshots. Izuku groaned, resting his head against the door. This sucks. Eventually even the sound of the gunshots died down. Izuku slid down the door, staring across his room. It wasn't that he hated his room, normally teenagers would love to be in their room and be left the hell alone, probably like you readers, tbh, it was just that he didn't like being locked up like this. There was a few books in the corner, and he had one of his oldest notebooks lying on his desk. He was fairly sure it was no .3, and even a computer. He had told Kurogiri that he didn't need one, but Kurogiri went and brought him one anyways, and Izuku was fairly sure he couldn't have been any more grateful, albeit a little guilty, along with a few video games stacked up neatly. He had a few things to do, that was for certain, but he didn't want to do anything in his room. Oddly enough, the internet held nothing of interest to him except for trending hero stories, but honestly, Izuku really couldn't put two and two together. His mind was a mess. Izuku wrapped his arms around his legs, bringing them further to his chest as he rested his head on his knees. He loved Tomura, but sometimes he was just too controlling, he supposed. There were times that Izuku generally feared that Tomura would become a villain. But surely he was just overthinking things. Tomura wouldn't become a villain. Sure, he hated heroes, but that wasn't a reason to become a villain, was it? Well, actually, if he hated heroes enough he could probably end up being a villain just to kill them. Tomura nai is unpredictable, and with his quirk and outbursts, it's actually quite possible. I've only seen his quirk a few times, and from what I know, it appears that he can disintegrate whatever he touches. But what would that do to a human? Would it have the same effect? Or perhaps it'd be worse. Tomura can be violent, and it's actually kind of obvious he's willing to hurt others as he has before. On top of that, I know he's worried, but with all his threats on Kaken's life, and then me actually finding him at school, practically ready to jump someone, there is a possibility. Not only that, but he doesn't really regard laws which much thought, and he's come dangerously close to breaking some severe laws which could easily put him in prison for quite a few years. But there's no way Tomura nai would become a villain, even if he does show signs of it sometimes. Unbeknownst to Izuku, he was mumbling his thoughts out loud, and Tomura was just outside his door, listening to his words intently. He sighed, deciding all he could do was hope that Izuku would never become a hero. He didn't want their paths to cross. Even if he did somehow get into the UA, perhaps there would be no way of them ever meeting, as a hero and villain. Right. He just had to keep hope for that. He slouched, still listening for Izuku to continue his rant. As no more sound came, he debated just returning to his room, but decided against it. He didn't want to let Izuku go yet. He couldn't become a hero. He had to stop that somehow. Frowning, Tomura leaned against Izuku's bedroom door before sliding down himself. Light from his room down the hallway reached the corridor, at least offering him some solace. Though he did prefer the dark, he found it oddly comforting. Suppressing a sigh, Tomura pulled his legs up slightly, resting his hands in his lap. He really didn't want Izuku to be a hero. But then again, could he actually find a way to stop him? At the very least, he'd wait to see if Izuku could get into the UA. There was a high chance of him failing, as he was now, so perhaps he didn't need to worry. But if Izuku actually found a way into the UA, then he'd have to take action somehow. He'd go to any means to ensure that Izuku never becomes a hero. He would be better at being a villain anyways, even if he did have such a soft heart. Perhaps all it took was a forceful change of will. A twist of fate. Yes, that was all Izuku needed, Tomura concluded. A twist of fate. Chapter FOUR. When Izuku next woke up, the first thing he noticed this time was that his neck was sort of stiff. He leaned forward with a slight groan, trying to release some of the pressure on his neck. He really shouldn't have slept like that. He rolled his head around, feeling a sense of relief. His mind rebooted instantly, and Izuku knew what kind of situation he was in almost immediately. Sometimes having a fast brain has its ups and downs. Izuku wasn't quite sure which one this one was. Realizing that his headache had faded, he was thankful for the small miracles. Izuku stood up, stretching out his limbs the second he had regained his balance. There was a small shuffle on the other side of the door, catching his attention. "Hello?" he called out uncertainly. He faced the door, half expecting the door to suddenly be blown off its hinges, half expecting someone to answer him or ignore him. "Are you going to school tomorrow?" a voice asked. Izuku rolled his eyes, already realizing where this conversation was going. If he said yes, Tomura would proceed to keep him locked in his room until it was too late to go to school, but if he said no, then Tomura might actually let him out. But the sigh, Izuku spoke up. No, Tomura Nai. I am not going to school tomorrow, he deadpanned. This should be against the law. Maybe it actually was against the law. He'd have to check. Then he might have something to use against Tomura the next time he does something like this. Though he doubted his brother and everything, Blood would actually care that he was breaking the law. Good, Izuku heard the key jingling in the lock, and mentally he cheered. Tomura pushed the door open, one hand in his pocket, as he stared dully at him, and the other still in the air from pushing the door open. Izuku was quick to slip under his arm, not wanting Tomura to suddenly have a reason to lock him back in his room again. Please stop doing that, Izuku deadpanned, as he walked away from Tomura. All you have to do is listen to me, and I'll stop. I have a right to my opinion, Izuku stated dryly, as they walked down the stairs. Not when it's so annoying, Tomura scoffed. Tomura, that's mean, he reprimanded absent-mindedly. How is that even remotely mean? Tomura cried. Izuku just stopped, his hand placed on the door to the bar. He ended with a shrug, before fully walking into the bar. He heard Tomura muttering to himself, but he decided to ignore him. Thanks to the painkillers, Izuku was thankful the second he saw Kurogiri at the bar. Kurogiri looked up upon their arrival, and he gave a small nod. I figured you'd need them. You worried me when you knocked yourself out, Izuku. You really should be more careful. Concussions are not something to be taken lightly, Izuku, Kurogiri lectured. Izuku rolled his eyes, but a small smile was on his face. He was glad he had people who cared for him, even if one of them was slightly controlling at times. I know, Izuku muttered, taking a seat at one of the stools, while Tomura headed over to his usual seat on the sofa. It was then Izuku noticed that it was someone else in the bar, and he gave them a small smile, and they nodded back, before Izuku returned to face Kurogiri. Fuck. Tomura cried. Izuku turned to face him, worry written over his face. What? What's wrong? Izuku asked. I forgot that Sensei is coming later. Damn, I still have some things to prepare. Tomura jumped from the couch, running from the bar. Izuku stared after him, clearly confused. He turned back to Kurogiri. Should I be here? I can leave if you want. Izuku knew how secretive the two were, so he felt as if he shouldn't intrude. It was their business after all. No, it's fine. I think Sensei enjoys talking to you, so I wouldn't say you have anything to be worried about, Kurogiri assured, cleaning one of his glasses, as usual. Izuku nodded, only just noticing that Kurogiri had placed a drink in front of him. With a small thanks, he picked up the glass and drank some of the juice. Is something major happening? He asked. No, I believe Sensei just had a few things to discuss with Tomura that he doesn't want to talk about over his usual calls. Something more personal, perhaps, Kurogiri explained. He might have something to say to you too, just in case you might want to be prepared. Izuku nodded, mind wandering off with many different possibilities. Talking with Sensei was always quite interesting. Izuku didn't realize he had dozed off until he began waking up again. He remembers talking to Kurogiri, the two having a perfectly normal conversation despite it being past midnight. He must have put his head down for a couple of seconds and drifted off at one point. Should I wake him up? Tomura's voice asked. Was he referring to me? Izuku thought in question, but his mind was too tired to comprehend anything. Weird. His thoughts were all mumbled recently. No, I believe he will be fine, as he is. Kurogiri, however, I'm afraid I must ask you to leave for a couple of minutes, a different voice stated. For a few seconds, Izuku felt eyes staring at him before they shifted elsewhere. That's fine, Sensei. I'll take my leave now, Kurogiri stated before Izuku heard light footsteps and then the click of a door. Oh, that's right, Sensei was coming. If his mind had been working normally, he probably would have bolted up and greeted Sensei. But his mind was still far too muddled to think thoroughly, so he stayed in his current position. Perhaps he could just go back to sleep. I believe there was something you had to ask me. Yeah. There is. But I'm not sure if we should talk about it when Izuku is in the room, even if he is asleep. It's about him, after all, Tomura mumbled. Izuku could feel eyes on him once more. It looks like he's still asleep, so I think it should be fine. Unless you want to move elsewhere. There was silence before he heard Tomura sigh. Sensei, is there a way to make someone hate heroes? Tomura asked. Izuku was confused. Why would he want to know something like this? Oh? You want to find a way to make Izuku hate heroes? Izuku would be a great villain. With his intellect, he could easily pick out on heroes' weaknesses. His analyzing skills are great, probably even better than mine. He might not be able to fight, but that's fine. I can protect him. He won't even need to fight. He just needs to analyze heroes like he always does. He'd be the perfect battle stagiist. But how do you change someone's will without them even realizing you're doing it? Tomura asked. There was silence. For some reason he couldn't comprehend, Izuku's heart began beating faster. He felt himself fear something, his body turning cold and cautiousness creeping through him. Change someone's will without them realizing? How would you do that? And why? Izuku thought in confusion. Finally, Sensei spoke up. This may be the first time you've expressed Iwan for something other than killing All Might. Very well, I will help you. This is, after all, for your benefit. Knowing how to change someone's will may come in use eventually. Cold fear washed through Izuku. What was going on? He didn't understand. He tried to come up with reasons to counter what was being said, or perhaps make sense of it, but his mind drew up a blank. Helpful. Really? Yes. Even I cannot deny that the boy has potential, though his dream will get in the way. It would be best to just crush it while you can, and have more time to build him back up again, Sensei spoke. Oh god, he needed to stop them here. Though his brain didn't quite understand what exactly was so dangerous about that, his body still screamed at him to do something. Izuku let out a small whine, lifting his head up slightly, signaling that he was awake. He could feel tension rising in the air, only further putting him on guard. He could feel their stares being shifted towards him. We will continue this later, Tomura. Yes, Sensei. Izuku lifted his head up, mind still far too blank for his liking. Concussions truly did suck. He shoved his hands in front of him, stretching. He hadn't even realized how stiff his body was. Hey, sleepyhead, Tomura called, walking up behind him. Izuku turned around, tired eyes staring at him. What? Feeling any better? Oh. So he was pretending like nothing happened. Izuku made a mental note to thoroughly think about this entire ordeal, once his brain was functioning properly again. I feel horrible, Izuku mumbled. His sight shifted to Sensei, eyes widening in fake surprise. Sensei. It was at this moment that he fully snapped awake, faking an alarm. He jumped from the chair, stumbling in his haste. Why didn't you wake me up? He hissed at Tomura, who merely shrugged in reply, a lazy grin on his face. Izuku sent a short glare to him before turning back to Sensei, shoving what he had recently heard to the back of his mind. Though now that he was more awake, his mind began to recognize just what kind of conversation they were having, and why. Panic flashed through his eyes, too fast for Tomura to see, but more than enough for Sensei to notice. He was standing in a room of villains. The people who stood alongside him all these years were villains. Though he couldn't stop just caring for Tomura, he wasn't entirely sure what to think now that one of his worst fears had been confirmed. Hello, Sensei. It's nice to see you again. He bowed slightly, hopefully keeping his face hidden, as another flash of panic forced its way onto his face. He needed time to think through this. Now wasn't the time. It's a pleasure, Izuku, Sensei replied with a small nod. Oh yes, Tomura. The plans that you wanted to show me? Sensei turned his attention to Tomura, whose face lit up in remembrance before he walked from the room with a small "Be right back." Izuku watched him leave in silence. Plans. Immediately, Izuku's mind skyrocketed to the worst-case scenario. Please don't tell me they are villain plans. Izuku thought desperately. Once the door clicked shut, Sensei turned to him. I know you were awake. How much did you hear? Sensei asked after a couple seconds of silence. Izuku froze, blood running cold once more. He stared at Sensei with wide, fearful eyes, looking much like a cornered animal. He opened his mouth to stutter out some sort of lie, but Sensei beat him to it. It's no use lying to me, Izuku, Sensei replied evenly, voice surprisingly calm. Izuku took a step back, bumping into the bar counter, now officially feeling like a cornered animal. Taking a deep breath, Izuku gathered his thoughts, mind finally working. Why would Tomura want that? Izuku asked unsurely. He might, as well, get some answers, even if he didn't like the results. He had his doubts for quite some time now, and considering they had just been confirmed, he was slightly, very much, freaking out. At the very least, he needed some answers. Even if the answer isn't something that he wants, he needs some sort of solace. Solace that comes in the form of answers. Isn't that obvious? Not only is he attached to you, but he can see your potential. We both can. What do you mean by potential? Izuku tensed, prepared to run just in case things got out of hand. The world may not see it, Izuku, but we can. You have so much potential to become something bigger, yet your potential is wasted every single day. Your quirkless status is nothing more than a mere chip in the road, it can be overcome easily, Sensei explained. What are you trying to say? Izuku urged, suddenly feeling very self-conscious. He was talking about potential, but they were talking about villains earlier though, so he doubted that Sensei was trying to say he could be a hero. Your mind and determination are your strongest traits. Something most villains often lack, but would be strong if they obtained such things. What? Was he saying that Izuku was better, as a villain? That wasn't right. If Izuku was either a hero or villain, it had to be a hero. He couldn't be a villain. Villains were, well, they were villains. That was the exact opposite of what Izuku wanted to be. I am afraid you are aiming for the wrong side, Izuku. Will you not become a villain? I have no reason or drive to be a villain. Besides, I've always wanted to be a hero, Izuku stated, hands grasping the counter behind him. His eyes darted back and forth before landing on the door, mind already trying to draw up some sort of plan. Though he doubted he had much of a chance for success, it was still worth a shot. That can easily be changed, Izuku, Sensei took a step forward. Izuku cursed, pushing himself away from the corner and darting towards the door. He inwardly screamed at himself, wishing that he had never woken up to begin with. Izuku wasn't even halfway to the door when he blinked and Sensei was suddenly in front of him. He halted to a stop, mind reeling and fear coursing through him. He attempted to jump back, but a black substance crawled up his legs, clinging to him. Izuku looked down in shock. Izuku started, but cut himself off as Sensei placed a hand on his head. He looked up, eyes wide with fear and seemingly glowing. I do not want to kill you, Izuku, as I can see your potential. However, there are some things in your mind that must be altered. For you to remain useful to us, Sensei spoke. Izuku let out a heave of air, close to hyperventilating. Oh god, this was bad. This was very bad. What are you going to do? Izuku breathed. He didn't know Sensei's quirk, so he had no clue how to react or even counterattack. A sharp pain in his head silenced all his thoughts. Izuku sucked in a pained breath. All you need is some altering, Izuku. Tomura can still learn so much more from you, so I will not kill you just yet. I will patiently await the day you two clash. With that, Izuku's world went black, his body collapsing. The last thing he felt was the splitting pain in his head. Izuku groaned as he pulled himself up from his bed. He pulled himself from his bed. He felt great for some reason. He vaguely remembered that he was supposed to have a concussion, but there was no pain or even grogginess. Perhaps he was just lucky. Shrugged, Izuku left the room. He wandered down the halls idly, trying to think of something to do. It was then that he remembered that Sensei was supposed to be visiting. Izuku cursed, rushing down the stairs. That's weird, Izuku thought. What was Sensei to him? Izuku pushed the door to the bar open, eyes scanning the room. Where's Sensei? He asked as he walked in, taking a seat at the bar. Kurogiri placed a drink in front of him, Izuku silently thanking him. Tomura looked up from his Game Boy, eyes scanning him. They already left, you slept through, Tomura muttered, seemingly uninterested. He returned to his game. Izuku huffed, annoyed. Man, I missed him. That sucks, he muttered, drinking from the cup Kurogiri had given him. Thanks Kurogiri, he added on an afterthought. Might as well verbalize his thanks. Kurogiri nodded, cleaning a glass from behind the counter. Tomura chose to ignore him, not having any further reply. Izuku could hear the gunshots from his game. It was starting off as a normal day. But once again, the word normal was often different for a child named Midoriya Izuku. By normal, he means, stop one of Tomura's fits and basically order him around until he finally forces the man-child to bed and then proceeds to run to school. As Izuku ran to school, he couldn't help but detour the second he saw a villain attack. He was easily able to weave through the small crowd thanks to his small size. Eyes widening in admiration and amazement, Izuku cried out. Ah, this is going to be good. It's Kamui Woods. He may be new, but he's making a big name for himself. When I look at that Dobby grin, I know what you are. A fanboy, the man next to him says, pointing at him. Izuku ceases his amazement for a few seconds and tears his eyes away from the fight to stare at the man addressing him. Izuku pays little mind to the spike sticking from the man's head. Sort of, Izuku mutters, looking away sheepishly. Tomura had always told him to dial it down, especially when near him or in public. Guess it really did show, much more than he thought. Or maybe that was because he kept muttering to himself all the time. Kamui Woods jumped on the criminal's arm, running along it, and snagged the criminal's other arm with his own one that had grown. The criminal uses Kamui's own attack against him and swings him through the air, but Kamui easily lands on top of a train with grace. Izuku's eyes widened. One day, he'll definitely be just like that. He'll be strong and graceful or whatever, too. He'll be a hero too one day. Heroes are only in it for fame or money, Tomura's words echo in his mind. Slightly, ever so slightly, Izuku's grin drops just a little. Assault, robbery, and illegal use of powers during rush hour traffic, Kamui lists. You're the incarnation of evil. And think about it. Heroes are so cheesy. Seriously, just look at them. Tomura's voice echoes in his head once more. It wasn't really an insult to heroes, so Izuku isn't exactly fazed by the memory, but he can't help but agree. Perhaps that was just a little bit too cheesy for his taste. But he was a hero, so it didn't matter. He was doing the right thing, and that was all that mattered. There. His special move. Izuku cries, pointing to the scene. "Mon tree man. Try something flashy." The man next to him cheers. In his mind, Izuku can't help but belittle the man beside him. How can trees be flashy? That was an incorrect saying given the situation. Izuku then mentally scolds himself and tells himself to shut up and not be mean. The primitive Izuku starts. Binding Liquorice chain prison. Kamui shouts, Izuku also shouting along like a child singing to their favorite song. The villain attempts to cover his face to help protect himself from the attack, only for someone else to come flying onto the scene. Onion cannon. A different hero screams as they kick the villain in the face, pushing him through the wall of the bridge and also pushing him off said bridge. Izuku freezes, caught in surprise. What the actual where the heck when did she who is SH his mind races immediately, trying to put a name to a face of the random giant hero who literally just came crashing onto the scene from nowhere and knocking the villain out appeared. Kamui freezes in his tracks, staring at the spot the villain had once been. Izuku keeps his balance as the ground shakes from the impact of the two large bodies falling and landing on the ground. Izuku is then shoved to the side as various people yank their phones out to take a picture of the new hero. Izuku has a vague suspicion that they're not taking her picture just because she's a new hero. Fucking vultures, as Tomura or Kaken would call them. They were more like than they realized. Also, wasn't that phrase just for the press? Izuku stared at all the men taking pictures and all the flashes of light. Money shot. Money shot. Money shot. No. They were fucking vultures too. They were enough like the press. Piece of cake for the world's next hottest hero. Hi there everyone, I'm Mount Lady. And you don't have to worry about this bum anymore, Mount Lady introduced herself with a wink. Izuku gagged, turning away. What the actual hell? Losing interest immediately, Izuku began walking away. The man beside him stared at him, but made no move to talk to him. She was obviously a hero for publicity, that much Izuku could tell almost instantly. A small spark of hatred flared in Izuku, but he ignored it. It was so small it was practically non-existent, but still there nonetheless. He was aware of his hatred he had for people like that, but he didn't like focusing on it or even expressing his hatred. It didn't really suit him, and, as weird as it may sound, he hated feeling hatred, which was honestly quite a weird feeling. Which was probably why he never chose to focus on that feeling anyways. Izuku pulls his notebook out and begins sketching a small drawing of Mount Lady. While he already may not like her, she still had a useful quirk. It was definitely an amazing one. It had a lot of uses, but at the same time a lot of disadvantages. For starters, if she couldn't control the height she grew to, she wouldn't be able to fight in small places, making her ineffective in fights where she couldn't use her quirk as much. On top of that, she'd be unable to reach certain areas due to her size. But in that case, she could just shrink and then reach the area at her normal size before turning into a giant again. At the same time, she'd be terrible for undercover missions. Her quirk literally made her the center of attention, and if you're undercover, then that's instantly mission over. As Izuku mumbled to himself, he absent-mindedly kept on the path to school. Izuku was happy for small miracles. They may be small, but honestly they were all he could ever get. Big miracles never came, but at least the small ones appeared here and there. Far better than nothing. Small miracles included missing confrontations or small embarrassments or in some cases, being able to avoid being beat up. The latter was the best miracle. But of course his miracles never lasted. They never did, and he never really expected them to. Life was against him, and Lady of Luck seemed to hate his guts most days, especially when it was raining. Hopefully, one day she would be on his side. Just not today. Izuku stared at his smoking notebook in the hands of one-ticket Kitsuki Bakugo. Kaken Izuku whimpered, inwardly praying his actual notes hadn't been harmed by the blast of the explosion. He had worked so hard on all those notes, so much that they had practically been ingrained. Though, even if they had been ingrained, there would always be a few notes that he would forget, and it was good to keep them on record if he ever needed them. Kitsuki chucked the notebook out the open window behind him. Izuku screeched, staring in despair at the window like it had just shattered his dreams. Kitsuki placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder, his hand smoldering with smoke. Izuku inwardly screeched, staring at Kitsuki's hand in fear, not knowing whether Kitsuki would attempt to blow his arm up or not. Do me a favor. Don't apply to UA, nerd, Kitsuki growled, a sickening sweet grin on his face. He pulled his hand away and began walking away. I can apply if I want to. Izuku shouted, gathering all the courage he could muster. Kitsuki turned to face him, halfway to the door, and an annoyed sneer on his face. Workless losers like you can't become fucking heroes. Just save yourself the trouble. But hey. If you want a quirk so badly, just throw yourself off the fucking roof and hope to get one in the next life. Kitsuki shouted, his lackeys in front of him snickering at his words. Izuku froze, blood running cold. You shouldn't joke about things like that, Kaken. Izuku muttered loud enough for him to hear. Who said I was joking? Explosions rippled in Kitsuki's hand as he sneered at Izuku. Izuku's eyes widened before his head lowered and a shadow fell over his eyes. Izuku picked up his bag and began walking to the other door at the front of the room, deciding not to say anything else. He figured Kaken would probably get mad at him for ignoring him, but honestly Izuku didn't care. Tomura would be annoyed if he was late coming back anyways. He didn't have any more time to waste here for something like this. Kitsuki stared at Izuku as he left, a shadow blocking his eyes from sight. Kitsuki huffed but said nothing, his own face going eerily unreadable, but eyes calculating. Just you fucking wait, shitty Deku, I'll find out what you're fucking hiding, Kitsuki thought, before turning back to his lackeys, a sneer back on his face. Izuku stared at his notebook in the koi pond. My dreams have become fish food, he sighed. To think, all the hard work and the late nights thinking and analyzing it was nothing but overcooked fish food now. Izuku pulled his notebook from the pond, inwardly hoping that his work could still be salvaged somewhat. He'd have to redo all the work he had done in another notebook, most likely. He began his walk home, or rather, his second home, flipping through the pages of his notebook as he did so. He vaguely recalled the days he and Kaken weren't actually enemies, but rather, friends. Close ones, at that. Hey, Deku, what the fuck are you doing? Let's fucking go already. Kaken shouted, frowning at him. Izuku looked up from his notes. Huh? What? He mumbled, having not been paying any attention to his surroundings. Come on. We're gonna be late. What are you even doing, nerd? Kaken asked, walking up to him. He pushed the edge of the book down so he could see what Izuku had been writing. Despite already being a few inches taller than Izuku, Kitsuki was unable to see due to him having shoved the book so close to his face. What is this? Hero notes. I've been studying all the different heroes and writing about them. Izuku explained enthusiastically. Hero notes. What the fuck? Kaken scoffed. I already told you. You don't need no other damn heroes, you already have me. I know, Izuku laughed, scratching his neck sheepishly. But it's good to make notes on them since one day I might be able to fight alongside them. Stupid Deku, Kaken mumbled, frowning at him. He chose not to comment on Izuku's quirkless status. Perhaps that wouldn't stop him after all. You better have me in there. You know I'm gonna be the best fucking hero around. Of course. See, you're in the first pages. You even use up 4 pages while all the other heroes only use up 2, Izuku gestured to his book, having flipped through to the front to show Kitsuki the picture of himself and all the notes Izuku had made on him. Kaken snatched the notebook from him, eyes scanning through all the notes Izuku had gathered on him. The next No.1 hero. Bakugo Kitsuki. Quirk. Explosions. Izuku stared at Kaken nervously, the boy having not reacted for a while now. He had switched through the 4 pages repeatedly, intense eyes staring down at the chicken scrawls that was Izuku's messy writing. Kitsuki scoffed, handing the book back to Izuku. Not bad, he mumbled, shoving his hands in his pockets and walking away. Also, damn right I'm gonna be the next #1 hero, just you fucking watch. I will, Izuku hummed, shoving his notebook into his bag and catching up to Kitsuki. He grinned at him. You'll be the next #1 hero for sure. Damn straight. You better keep those fucking notes updated, you'll bloody need them, Kaken grumbled. Izuku's grin widened and he nodded. I'll do that too. -0. Izuku opened his charred notebook, staring at the slightly damaged first page. Bakugo Kitsuki. He stared at the doodle and notes written across the page and sighed. Silly Kaken, you damaged your own page, he muttered, and with another sigh, closed his book. His mind drifted off to All Might, his idol. Any sign of misery or depression faded away instantly as he began to imitate All Might's laugh. That's right. All he had to do was keep his head high and smile, just like All Might, and everything would surely work out. Izuku raised his fist into the air, laughing loudly as he stepped through the tunnel. The sound of metal hitting the concrete made him stop, turning around in slight curiosity and fear as to what the sound was. The manhole to the sewer had been blown off by something, but Izuku couldn't see what had happened. As if on cue, a ball of green slime shot out of the hole. Izuku screeched, turning to run away and get as far away as possible just as the very same green sludge constricted him, the impact heavy on his back. Izuku heaved, the air having been knocked out of him. His notebook dropped to the floor as the wet slimy green thing began to suffocate him. A medium-sized invisibility cloak. The goo asked, towering over him. It seemed to be analyzing him. Izuku gasped, taking a step back, and watched the vile goo, waiting to see what would happen. He forced himself to remain calm. To remember what Tomura taught him. If he were to let himself be taken over with fear, then he wouldn't find a way out of this situation, and also, if he went back with too many injuries, Tomura would be mad, and that was an outcome he'd like to avoid. He didn't want to be locked up again. The goo took its chance, springing forward. Izuku gasped upon feeling the impact to the chest, and immediately, the goo was shoving itself into his mouth and down his throat. His notebook clattered away from him, being thrown off into a direction Izuku couldn't see. Izuku retched as the stench filled his nostrils and his gag reflex kicked in, but it wasn't enough to stop the invasion or even slow it down in any way. Izuku weakly clawed at the goop, hoping he could pry it off him, but every time he even managed to move even the tiniest bit of slime, more just replaced it. It was like water. Very disgusting, bad-smelling water. Don't worry, a voice reached his ears, and Izuku immediately knew it belonged to the goop. I'm just going to take over your body, it continued. How was that supposed to help? He didn't want him to take over his body. Calm down. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. Tomura would kill him if he knew he had that long to escape and still couldn't find a way. His eyes desperately flashed back and forth, trying to figure out a way of escape. His eyes were blocked though. He couldn't see past the goop, and the only thing he could see was the ceiling. He had no weapons or anything he could use. He vaguely recalled he had a pen stashed in his pocket, but he wasn't sure what that would do. He desperately tried to think, doing his best to ignore the feeling of his body slowly and painfully being taken over. You'll feel better soon. It still continued to speak to him. Izuku genuinely wasn't sure if this villain was actually trying to comfort him or not, but either way, it wasn't having any effect. The only thing Izuku could make out of it was the fact it had a mouth. Wait. From what Izuku could tell so far, its body was mostly just this disgusting slime, but if it had something that resembled a face, could there be a weakness? He tried to grab the slime again, so he could at least try to pull its face towards him. One hand reached for the slime while the other pulled his pen out of his pocket. You can't grab me. I'm fluid. It laughed, clearly mocking him. Izuku almost scowled at it. Though he doubted it would have looked like a scowl with the slime suffocating him like this. Thanks for your help. You're my hero, it continued, and Izuku couldn't help the flicker of rage. Hero? No. Izuku looked up, glaring at the slime, and almost gasped in shock upon seeing the yellow eye staring down at him. The slime forced its way further down into his body, and Izuku could feel himself losing consciousness. But he knew what to do now. Tightening his grip on his pen, with the last of his strength, he lunged forward, stabbing the pen into the slime's eyes. It screeched an ugly sound that bounced off the walls, as it loosened its grip on Izuku just enough so he could gasp for air. But at that moment of time, his vision was already so dark that it didn't matter. Just as he lost consciousness, he felt the slime being ripped away or pushed away from his body. Faintly, he could have sworn he heard the words. It's alright now, young man. I am here. Izuku didn't know what happened after that. Someone repeatedly lightly slapping his face woke him up. What happened? His body hurt and he felt lightheaded. Was it another one of Tomura's breakdowns again? Hey. If that was the case, then he really didn't want to get up. His breakdowns were violent, and with this quirk, things tended to get out of hand real fast. Hey. But Tomura was like his older brother. He should be there for him when he needs him. With that last thought, Izuku pried his tired eyes open. Oh. Thank goodness. A relieved voice cried. Izuku looked towards the sound of the voice and almost died right there because that was All Might, and letting out a screech, Izuku got up immediately, ignoring the way his body protested. He scurried back, shocked. I'm glad you're okay. All Might said, standing up to his full height. Sorry about getting you caught up in my villain fighting, All Might apologized, and all Izuku could do was continue to stare at him because the number was in front of him and Bachilito. I don't usually make mistakes like this, but I was in high spirits on my day off in a new place. All Might let out a boisterous laugh, his hand to his forehead. Izuku let out a nervous laugh, staring at All Might in both confusion and shock as he tried to wrap his head around the situation. All Might, the number one hero, was right in front of him after having just saved him. But, you were a big help. Thanks. Another laugh. He was even thanking him. Izuku didn't want to wake up from this dream. This was a perfect dream. He refused to wake up from this. Not only had All Might appeared and saved him, but he was thanking him too. All Might held up a bottle containing the Sludge Villain from earlier. Izuku blinked out of his stupor upon seeing one of the eyes of the villain. Izuku had stabbed the villain right in the eye with his pen, and clearly, it had left some damage. Izuku winced, feeling just a little guilty. He knew he should probably feel more guilty over this, but for some reason, he couldn't. It had attacked him and suffocated him. Izuku had merely retaliated out of self-defense. But still its eyes looked horrible. He probably wouldn't be able to use that eye again. I captured him safely. All Might cheered. Izuku switched his gaze back to All Might, trying to suppress his feelings of guilt and instead looked over All Might's form. All Might looked different in person, now that he thought about it. He was the real thing, without a doubt. Maybe because he was more intimidating. Oh, right. An autograph. Izuku immediately scanned his own body, trying to find his notebook and a pen. He held in a cringe. He didn't want that pen back. Where should I? He finally spotted his notebook a little while away. He quickly reached for it. In that notebook he opened it up, only to see that All Might had already signed it for him. He already did. Izuku screeched, shocked. He turned to All Might and repeatedly bowed. He didn't know how he could express his thanks enough. Thank you very much. It'll be an heirloom. A family treasure. As long as Tomura didn't find it anyway. In which case, the boy would disintegrate it immediately. All Might gave him a thumbs up. Okay. Then he patted his pants pockets, gesturing to the villain he had contained in the bottles. Well, I need to take this guy to the police. All Might turned around, but then tilted his body back and held up a hand. See you again on the other side of the screen. That radiant smile was on his face, as usual. Izuku's heart sank. Wait, already? He asked unsurely. There was something that Izuku still wanted to ask him. Something he needed to ask him. Otherwise, he'd never be able to. He wanted to prove Tomura wrong. All Might began to stretch his legs, readying himself for leaving. Pros are constantly fighting enemies, and time, All Might stated. Izuku's eyes widened and he reached a hand forward. There are still things he wanted to ask. He knew All Might didn't have time to answer all his questions, but there were 2 questions that he had to ask All Might, no matter what. Well then, All Might said, as he finished his stretching. Izuku's eyes widened even further. No. He had to have an answer, no matter what. From the person that everyone admired. From the person that was truly a hero. He needed a hero's opinion. Izuku lunged forward. I'm counting on your continued support. All Might yelled. There was a gust of wind, and Izuku was hurled upwards along with All Might. He clung to the man's leg, not daring to let go. Wait, All Might's voice sounded suspicious. Clearly he had noticed he had an unwanted tag-along. All Might looked down, and sure enough, he noticed Izuku had stuck to him. Hey, 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 hey. All Might cried. All Might pushed a hand onto his head, trying to shove him off. Let go of me. Your fanaticism is too much. But he couldn't let go now. If I let go now I'll die. Izuku gasped, fear coursing through him, as he hoped he could hold on long enough, and that All Might didn't push him off before they landed. All Might ceased immediately, holding his hand away. That's true, he admitted, seeming to only just realize that. I have a lot of things I want to ask you directly. It was so hard to speak with all the air pressure against his face. Okay. I get it, so lose your eyes and mouth. All Might ordered. Izuku did as he was told and then buried his head into All Might's leg. All Might reached back, holding onto him so he wouldn't fall off. Izuku could vaguely hear All Might coughing. There was a loud bang as they finally landed and Izuku let go, slithering down to the floor. He never wanted to do that again. It was horrifying. He wheezed for breath. That was scary. He muttered, shaking like a leaf. He probably looked like a mess now too. But grief, All Might huffed, hands on his hips. If you talk to the people downstairs, I'm sure they'll let you down. All Might began to walk away. I seriously am out of time, so I really must go. At that, Izuku finally snapped back to attention, regaining himself. He sat up, looking towards All Might's retreating figure. Wait. He reached out to All Might, trying to stop him from leaving. No. I will not wait. All Might's voice was stern. But he gasped. You should probably give it up. His doctor stated. Izuku's hand froze in the air. I'm sorry, Izuku. His mother cried. I'm sorry. He began to draw his hand back, unsure. What the hell can you do? Kaken's angry voice demanded. You're quirkless. Izuku pulled his hand back. They'll never let you become a hero. Never. And even if they did, then I'd end up hating you and what you become. I'll end up hating them even more for taking you from me. Tomura screamed, chucking a chair in a random direction. It almost hit him. Izuku stood there, with his hands by his sides. He knew all of this. He was quirkless, he was weak, he was burdening his mother with his dream, he was trying to become something that someone precious to him hated the most. That might be true, but even so, Izuku clenched his fists, his body beginning to shake. He had to ask. He had to ask now. He wouldn't get this chance again. Even if I don't have a quirk, can I become a hero? Izuku yelled, his question finally reaching the person whose opinion mattered the most on this subject. Can even someone without a quirk be like you? Izuku yelled, closing his eyes as he waited for an answer that could either break him or build him. All Might turned around and Izuku waited for the reply that could potentially change his fate. Thanks for watching my video and make sure to check out the author of this fanfic, link is in the description, see you next time, till then sayonara.